David Kingsley. The officers working the medical unit at Marcy Correctional Facility believed the cameras were switched off. They believed no one was watching, and that whatever happened inside that exam room would stay inside that room. That belief is the only reason we know exactly what they did to Robert Brooks, because the body cameras were in fact recording the entire time. They simply weren't recording sound. The officers thought the devices were dormant, so they made no effort to hide anything, and they behaved as if there would never be a record. There was a record. Every second of it. Robert Brooks was 43 years old, and he was roughly a year away from going home. He had been serving a 12-year sentence for a first-degree assault conviction, with his release already scheduled for 2026. On December 9, 2024, he was transferred into Marcy, a state prison in upstate New York near Utica, and he arrived in handcuffs. He never left that facility alive. Inside a medical examination room, while he was handcuffed and offering no resistance, a group of officers punched him, kicked him, and struck him. David Kingsley was one of them. The silent footage captured him lifting Brooks off the ground by the neck. Brooks was taken to a hospital that night, and he died the following day, December 10th. The Onondaga County medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, caused by compression of the neck and multiple blunt force injuries. What made this case different was not the brutality by itself, but the fact that the brutality had been predicted. Years earlier, in 2022, 4 of the officers who would later be tied to Brooks's death had already been named in a lawsuit accusing a group of Marcy guards of operating as what inmates called a beat-up squad. Termination reports later identified a sergeant, Glenn Trombley, as the alleged leader of that squad. A separate report that same year had warned of physical assaults at the facility and pervasive allegations of racial discrimination. So none of this was a secret. The warnings existed in filings and in reports, and they sat on paper for years. Nothing changed until a man was dead. 10 officers were ultimately charged in connection with Robert Brooks's death, and prosecutors made a deliberate decision not to treat it as the act of one violent individual. Special Prosecutor William Fitzpatrick told the jury that the officers had acted together like a gang, and that all of them, together, had killed that man. It was a framing that mattered, because it went to the heart of how these units functioned. This was not one bad guard losing control. This was a crew doing what the crew did. On October 20th, 2025, David Kingsley was convicted of second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. According to Fitzpatrick, it was the first time in the history of New York State that a corrections officer had ever been convicted and sentenced for the murder of an inmate. Think about what that means for a moment. Not the first time a guard had killed someone in custody, the first time one had ever been held to account for it in this way. The footage that the officers assumed no one would ever see became the centerpiece of the trial. Brooks's son, Robert Brooks Jr., told the court that watching his father's final hours on camera felt like being trapped inside a horror movie, and that the officers were the monster in it. Kingsley, when it was his turn to speak, said that everything that had happened to Brooks over those final 3 days should never have happened, and that every single incident had been senseless. On December 19, 2025, Judge Robert Bauer sentenced Kingsley to the maximum available, 25 years to life. Fitzpatrick, looking at the full set of outcomes across everyone charged in the case, laid the sentences out plainly. 7 years, 15 years, 22 years, 22 years, and now life. 6 of the officers had pleaded guilty. 2 were acquitted. A sergeant pleaded guilty midway through his own trial in January of 2026. Kingsley himself had already resigned back in May, months before the verdict. The fallout stretched far beyond one courtroom. Brooks's death triggered a wildcat strike among corrections officers across the state that lasted roughly 3 weeks, and it became the case that finally pushed New York to pass a prison reform package, signed into law at the end of 2025, requiring cameras inside every state facility. There is a grim logic to that. The very technology that convicted Kingsley, the silent camera the officers assumed was dead, became the reason the law changed for every prison in the state. And it only worked because those officers were so confident they were untouchable that they never bothered to hide. Today, David Kingsley is in prison, serving 25 years to life. The Brooks case was historic because it was the first conviction of its kind in the state. But being first does not mean being alone, and the pattern behind it was not new. To understand how far back it runs, and how long officers managed to get away with it, before a camera ever caught them, you have to leave the state prisons of upstate New York entirely. You have to go down to a jail in New York City more than a decade earlier and meet a 52-year-old man who walked with a cane. Brian Call. Ronald Spear was not a dangerous man. He was 52 years old, he had late-stage kidney disease, and he leaned on a cane to get around. He had not been convicted of anything. He was a pre-trial detainee at Rikers Island, which means he was being held while his case moved through the courts, still legally presumed innocent. And on the night he died, the argument that set everything in motion was not about violence or contraband. It was about his health. Ronald Spear wanted to see a doctor. That was the entire dispute. He was being held in the North Infirmary Command, the unit at Rikers reserved for detainees with serious medical needs, which tells you how fragile his health already was. On December 19, 2012, Spear pressed to be seen by medical staff, and Correction Officer Brian Call responded to that request with his fists. Call punched him. Other officers moved in and restrained Spear, pinning him face down against the ground. And it was then, with a sick 52-year-old man held down and physically unable to fight back, that Call repeatedly kicked him in the head. What he did next is the detail that stayed with everyone who worked the case. Before Spear died, Call leaned down, lifted the dying man's head, and told him to remember who had done this to him. Ronald Spear died shortly afterward. The New York City medical examiner ruled it a homicide caused by blunt force trauma. Then came the cover-up, and it was every bit as calculated as the killing. Call and other officers filed false use of force reports claiming that Spear had attacked Call with his cane, that the officer had only been defending himself. A Rikers captain went a step further and instructed another officer to go retrieve a cane from a supply area so it could be planted at the scene as evidence. They were not just lying about what happened. They were manufacturing the physical proof to back the lie. For a while it worked. The story held, the reports were filed, and the death of a pretrial detainee with failing kidneys drew no serious scrutiny. But federal investigators eventually pulled the account apart, and in 2016, Brian Call went on trial in federal court. He was convicted of deprivation of rights under color of law resulting in death, along with conspiracy to obstruct justice and falsification of records. This was no longer a workplace incident buried in a use of force form. This was a federal civil rights prosecution, and the jury saw it for exactly what it was. When Call later appealed, a federal appeals court reviewed the whole case in 2019 and upheld the conviction in full. The sentencing hearing produced some of the most damning language ever aimed at a New York corrections officer. United States District Judge Loretta Preska told the courtroom, in the plainest possible terms, that Brian Call had kicked a man to death, and she described the attack as particularly vicious and callous. She also noted something investigators had found. Call had kept a framed newspaper clipping about the killing. The judge called it what it was, a trophy. And no, that is not an exaggeration for effect. Prosecutor Brooke Cusinella told the court that Call had joked to colleagues about getting a teardrop tattoo, the gang symbol traditionally understood to signify that its wearer has killed someone. He treated a man's death as a badge. The federal prosecutor who oversaw the case, United States Attorney Preet Bharara, summed the whole thing up with a line built around the words Call himself had used. Call, he said, had killed Speer by kicking him in the head as he lay restrained on the ground, and had told him not to forget who did this to him. The investigators and prosecutors, Bharara said, did not forget either. On September 13, 2017, Judge Preska sentenced Brian Call to 30 years in federal prison. Two of the officers involved in the cover-up, Anthony Torres and Byron Taylor, had already pleaded guilty in the conspiracy. New York City settled the wrongful death lawsuit brought by Speer's father for $2.75 million. Money that does nothing to bring a son back, but at least forced the city to formally acknowledge what its own jail had done to a man in its care. For Speer's family, the resolution was quiet and complete. His stepmother, Margaret Speer, said simply that her son could finally rest in peace and that the family could go on with their lives. And unlike so many of these cases, this one did not end in a plea bargain or a slap on the wrist. Call drew a full 30 years in a federal prison, where there is no parole, and where nearly the entire sentence must be served. He has been in continuous federal custody since 2015, and his projected release still sits many years out, somewhere around 2041. Brian Call will be an old man before he walks free, if he ever does. Call's case took the FBI and a federal jury to expose, and even then, it only cracked open because outside investigators refused to accept the report the officers had written. But there is a place in New York where that kind of brutality did not require a federal case to bring it out. Because according to the men who lived there, it was simply the way things worked. For that story, we move west, to a facility whose name has been shorthand for prison violence in America for half a century. Sean Warner. For decades, if you asked men who had done time across the New York prison system to name the single most frightening place they had ever been held, a striking number of them gave the same answer: Attica. Reporters who later interviewed more than 36 current and former Attica inmates found the same thing again and again. It was described as the most fearsome facility in the state, a place where a small group of correction officers handed out harsh punishment almost entirely as they pleased, with little fear of consequence. And within Attica, one corner in particular had a reputation: C Block, on the 3 to 11 evening shift, where the guards were known for enforcing the rules strictly and sometimes violently. Sean Warner was a sergeant on that block, and on August 9, 2011, he and two officers, Keith Swack and Matthew Rademacher, showed exactly what that reputation was built on. The inmate they targeted was George Williams, 29 years old, who was serving a 2 to 4 year sentence for robbing jewelry stores in Manhattan. What the three officers did to him in C Block that day was so severe it is difficult to square with the phrase use of force. Williams suffered 2 broken legs, a broken shoulder, a fractured eye socket, and cracked ribs. Surgeons at Erie County Medical Center had to insert a metal plate and 6 screws just to put him back together. To justify the beating, officers allegedly planted a razor blade so they could claim Williams had been armed and dangerous. Warner was accused of filing false reports to paper the whole thing over. Here is the part that should stop you. The only reason any of this ever came to light is that a prison nurse refused to let it go. She insisted that Williams be sent to an outside hospital rather than treated quietly inside the walls. If she had stayed silent, if she had simply signed off, George Williams would have been one more inmate with injuries that no one on the outside would ever question. You would think that inside a facility, someone would routinely speak up when this happened. According to the inmates who lived there, no one did. One prisoner who had spent more than 20 years inside Attica put it bluntly to reporters. What they did to Williams, how they jumped him, that was normal. It happened all the time. Because of that nurse, the case did not disappear. On December 13, 2011, a grand jury indicted Warner, Rademacher, Swack, and a fourth officer on first-degree gang assault. It was the first time in New York history that corrections officers had ever faced felony gang assault charges for beating an inmate. On paper, it was a landmark. For the first time, the machinery of the state was pointed at the guards instead of the prisoners. And this is where the story turns from horror to something colder, something closer to disappointment. On March 2, 2015, just before the case was set to go to trial, Warner, Swack, and Rademacher were allowed to plead guilty to a single misdemeanor count of official misconduct. Not felony gang assault, a misdemeanor. In exchange, they resigned from their jobs, and each received a 1-year conditional discharge. That means no prison time, not a single day. And on top of it, they walked away still holding their pensions. That is not a typo, by the way. 3 officers left a man with 2 broken legs, a broken shoulder, a fractured eye socket, and cracked ribs, requiring surgical hardware to repair, and the accountability that followed was a misdemeanor, a resignation, and a retirement check. The 4th officer had been given immunity in exchange for his testimony. The prosecutor who handled the case, Wyoming County District Attorney Donald O'Gene, framed the outcome around what he said had always been the real goal. The prosecution, he said, had always been about holding these officers accountable for abusing their power, and about getting them out of the corrections profession once and for all. Removing them from the job was a genuine win. But for anyone measuring the punishment against the injuries, the gap was impossible to ignore. And Warner, Swack, and Rademacher were not accused of a single bad day. All 3 had been named in other federal brutality lawsuits, part of a documented pattern rather than a one-time loss of control. That is what the C-Block reputation really meant. It was not a rumor so much as a way of operating that the men on the block had refined over years, confident it would never reach a courtroom. The reporting that documented all of this, an investigation that laid bare Attica's entire culture of fear, went on to become a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and it directly led to cameras being installed throughout the facility. George Williams survived, which sets his case apart from most of the others in this list. But the men responsible walked out of the system on their own terms. Sean Warner was never incarcerated. He resigned, he avoided a felony, and he kept his pension. In a story about guards who ruled through fear, his ending is its own kind of unsettling, because it shows how rarely that fear ever cost them anything at all. Attica revealed a culture that had been allowed to fester for decades, but you might assume that by the 2020s, with body cameras rolling and the Brooks case already making national headlines, officers would understand that the old rules no longer applied. One facility, less than 100 miles from where Robert Brooks died, proved that assumption catastrophically wrong, and it happened just 3 months later. Jonah Levi. In the spring of 2025, New York's prison system was in open crisis. Corrections officers across the state had walked off the job in a mass strike, and the National Guard had been called in to fill the empty posts and keep the facilities running. In other words, at the exact moment when the state was under the most scrutiny it had faced in years, with soldiers standing in for striking guards, you would think the remaining officers would be on their absolute best behavior. Instead, at Mid-State Correctional Facility on March 1st, 2025, a group of them beat a 22-year-old man to death. His name was Messiah Nantwi. He had entered the state prison system less than a year earlier, in May of 2024, serving a 5-year sentence for second-degree criminal possession of a weapon. He was 22 years old. He had years left on a sentence he was expected to survive. Jonah Levi was a correction officer with 17 years on the job, and he was a member of the facility's emergency response team. The unit made up of the officers considered most capable of handling volatile situations without letting them spiral. That detail matters. He was not a rookie who panicked, and he was not an untrained hire thrown into a crisis. He was, in theory, among the most experienced and most trusted officers in the entire building, precisely the person you would expect to keep a bad moment from becoming a lethal one. What the evidence showed he actually did to Messiah Nantwi is staggering. The forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy testified that Nantwi had suffered a little over 69 separate injuries, including at least 15 blows to the head. She described the bleeding in his brain as worse than what you might see in a professional prizefighter. Testimony established that Levi had stomped on Nantwi's head multiple times. Blood matching Nantwi's DNA was found on Levi's boots. 69 injuries, at least 15 of them to the head. From officers who were supposed to be maintaining order during a staffing emergency. And just as in the Brooks case at Marcy, the killing was immediately followed by an organized effort to bury the truth. The day after Nantwi died, on March 2nd, a group of officers gathered at a local diner at the direction of a sergeant, for one purpose. They were there to line up their stories and coordinate a false narrative about what had happened inside the facility. None of this was a panicked reaction in the heat of the moment, but cold strategy worked out calmly over a meal the morning after a man had been beaten to death. One sergeant would later plead guilty to planting a knife in Nantwi's cell, the fabricated justification for the assault. It was the Attica razor blade and the Rikers cane all over again, the exact same reflex to manufacture a weapon that was never there, in a different facility, in a different decade, by different men. Another officer pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received an 11-year sentence. And a third officer broke ranks entirely, cooperated with prosecutors, and testified against his former colleagues in open court. 10 officers were indicted in total. Levi was charged with the most serious counts, including second-degree murder, manslaughter, gang assault, conspiracy, and offering a false instrument. Prosecutors offered him a deal in October, a chance to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for an 18-year sentence. He turned it down and took his chances at trial. In early April of 2026, the jury convicted him of manslaughter, gang assault, conspiracy, and offering a false instrument. They acquitted him of murder, but the manslaughter conviction was more than enough. At sentencing, the judge did something that cut through all the legal language. Judge Michael Nolan told Levi that the body-worn camera footage had shown him the real man. In that footage, Nolan said, Levi was fist-bumping other officers, laughing and joking, while Messiah Nantwi lay on the floor of the infirmary, dying from the things Levi and the others had done to him. That image, a man celebrating over a body, is what the judge carried into his decision. Special Prosecutor William Fitzpatrick, the same prosecutor from the Brooks case, was just as direct. When you stomp on someone's head, he said, you are not trying to get their attention. You have divorced yourself from the human race. He also offered a flat assessment of Levi as an officer, calling him, simply, a lousy corrections officer. Nantwi's father, Patterson Nantwi, spoke to the fear at the center of all of this. The fear that runs through every case in this list. No one, he said, should have to fear losing their life at the hands of the very people who are supposed to care for them. On May 27, 2026, Judge Nolan sentenced Jonah Levi to the maximum, 25 years. Coming just 3 months after Robert Brooks was killed at nearby Marcy, the death of Messiah Nantwi confirmed what the reformers had been arguing all along. Brooks had not been a single tragic outlier. He was one point on a line, and mid-state was the next. Today, Jonah Levi is in prison, serving 25 years. If you're finding this video worth your time and you haven't subscribed yet, take a second to do it now. It genuinely helps the channel grow. Mohammed Shahid Jenkins. The officer at the center of nearly every case in this list was a line guard, someone relatively low in the chain of command. Mohammed Shahid Jenkins was different. He was a lieutenant and a shift commander at a maximum security prison in Alabama, a man with more than 20 years in law enforcement. And part of his actual job was to model for younger, less experienced officers what proper conduct looked like. He was supposed to be the example. And what that example did, when he believed no one who mattered was watching, was walk into a holding cell where a restrained man sat posing no threat to anyone, and assault him. Then walk out. Then walk back in and do it again. The facility was the William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility, a men's prison outside Birmingham. The victim in the central incident is identified in court records only by his initials, VR, and that is how we will refer to him here. On February 16, 2022, VR was restrained inside a holding cell. He was not fighting, he was not a danger to the officers around him, and by every account, he posed no threat that would justify any use of force at all. Jenkins used force anyway. He kicked the man and hit him. He sprayed him with chemical spray, then struck him with the metal can it came in, and with a shoe. And this was not one sudden burst of temper that he lost control of and immediately regretted. Over the course of roughly 5 minutes, Jenkins left the cell and came back into it repeatedly, again and again, to renew the assault on a man who could not defend himself. Afterward, he filed a report that left the force out entirely, as though none of it had happened. What the investigation also uncovered was that this had not been a one-time lapse. Jenkins later admitted that months earlier, on November 29, 2021, he had used force against a second inmate, identified only as DH. That man had been handcuffed and compliant, and Jenkins had repeatedly sprayed and struck him, including hitting him in the head with a spray can. The same pattern held: a restrained man, no real threat, and a supervisor who simply kept going long after any conceivable justification had passed. 2 separate incidents, 3 months apart, against 2 different men, both of them helpless at the time. What that describes is not a lapse, but a habit. The false report Jenkins filed after the February assault carried just as much intent as the beating. It was the mechanism that would have let the whole thing disappear. On paper, the force never happened, which meant there would be nothing to investigate. No reason for anyone above him to ask a single question. That is how these cover-ups are designed to work. And for a senior officer with 2 decades in, writing a report that made an assault vanish would have felt like routine. 9 days after the February assault, on February 25, 2022, VR died. It is important to be precise here, because precision is what the case itself demanded. Authorities did not rule his death a homicide, and Jenkins was never charged with causing it. What he was charged with, and what he ultimately admitted to, was the assault and the false report. The line between those two things matters a great deal, and the prosecution respected it. So we will respect it too. The case was investigated by the FBI's Birmingham field office alongside Alabama's own corrections investigators, and it moved into federal court as a civil rights prosecution. On September 12, 2023, Jenkins pleaded guilty. On December 19, 2023, he was sentenced to 87 months in federal prison, a little over 7 years, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The official who spoke most pointedly about the case was Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, who ran the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. She drew attention to exactly the thing that made Jenkins's conduct so damning. Here was a supervisor with more than 20 years of experience, someone whose entire role was to show the officers beneath him what proper law enforcement looked like. Instead, she said, he had abused his position of power to repeatedly and viciously assault a restrained inmate, returning to that cell several times to renew the attack. The FBI's special agent in charge, Carlton Peoples, added that the sentence was meant to send a clear message, that the Bureau remained committed to protecting the civil rights of everyone, including the people held inside a prison. Jenkins did not operate in a vacuum. Alabama's prison system for men has been the subject of a separate, sweeping Justice Department civil rights investigation and years of litigation over conditions found to be unconstitutional. That is the kind of environment where a senior officer might reasonably have assumed that walking in and out of a cell to beat a restrained man would simply never be examined by anyone. He assumed wrong. Today, Mohammed Shahid Jenkins is in federal prison, serving that 87-month sentence. Jenkins was a lieutenant who did the beating with his own 2 hands. But rank can be used a second way. It can be used to make other men do the beating for you, so that the person who set the whole thing in motion never has to throw a single punch. For that, we travel back to Rikers Island, to a chief who outranked nearly everyone in the building, and to a beating that began with nothing more than a look. Eliseo Perez Jr. Jamal Lightfoot's mistake, if you can even call it a mistake, was that he made eye contact. He was 28 years old, an inmate at Rikers Island, and during a search of his housing unit in July of 2012, he happened to lock eyes with one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire jail. That was it. That was the whole of the provocation. According to prosecutors, the chief took that glance as a challenge, decided this inmate thought he was tough, and set out to prove otherwise. But he did not do it himself. He gave an order. The man who gave the order was Eliseo Perez Jr., and his title tells you how much authority he was holding. He was an assistant chief for security at Rikers, sitting near the very top of the uniform chain of command. When a chief at that level singled you out on the floor, there was no higher officer standing there to appeal to. That is what makes his case stand apart from the others in this list. The danger did not come from a guard's fists. It came from a rank so high that a word from him could set 6 men in motion at once. Prosecutors said Perez turned to a captain and 5 officers and told them, in plain terms, that Lightfoot thought he was tough and that they should go and kick his teeth in. And they did exactly that. The officers took Lightfoot into a search cell, deliberately away from the main line of sight, and beat him where the housing unit could not watch. The damage was severe. He suffered fractured eye sockets and a broken nose, and his eyes swelled completely shut. Then came the part that, by this point in the list, you can probably predict on your own. To justify the beating, The officers filed false reports claiming that Lightfoot had slashed at one of them with a sharpened piece of metal, and that they had merely been defending themselves against an armed and dangerous inmate. There was no weapon. Lightfoot had not slashed anyone, but the false report did real harm all on its own. Based on that fabricated razor claim, Lightfoot testified that he was punished with roughly 110 days in solitary lockdown, so he was beaten badly enough to have both eyes swollen shut, and then he was punished on top of it for the lie invented to cover the beating. 2 injuries for the price of a single glance. For a while, the official version held, the way it so often does in these stories. But investigators eventually built a case that ran to 50 separate counts, and in June of 2016, it went before a jury. Perez was convicted. So was the captain, Gerald Vaughn, along with 4 of the officers who carried out the beating. On September 16, 2016, the sentences came down. Perez received 6.5 years in state prison. Vaughn received 5.5. The 4 officers who did the actual beating were given 4.5 years each. 2 others involved in the cover-up were ordered to perform 500 hours of community service, and 1 more officer accused in the aftermath was acquitted. The city's Department of Investigation Commissioner, Mark Peters, said the convictions made a strong statement that savagely beating an inmate would not be tolerated inside the city's jails. Lightfoot's attorney, Sanford Rubenstein, aimed his words at every officer in the country. "Let the message go out," he said, "that if you viciously assault an inmate, you may well become an inmate yourself." And that is precisely what happened to Eliseo Perez, a chief who never landed a blow, and who went to prison anyway for the blows he ordered other men to land. The spread of sentences told its own story about how the system finally apportioned blame. The man at the top, who gave the command, drew the most time. The captain who relayed it drew less. The officers whose hands did the actual damage drew less still. For once, the chain of command ran in the direction of accountability instead of protection. Perez's sentence of 6.5 years, beginning in the fall of 2016, would have run its course by around 2022 or 2023, and with New York's credit for good behavior, likely a good deal sooner. He is almost certainly a free man today, walking around somewhere, his time served. But the record does not soften with the passing of years. An assistant chief of security at one of the most notorious jails in America was convicted of orchestrating the beating of a man whose only offense was looking at him. And the reason a chief could do that, the reason a single glance could trigger a 5-officer assault in a search cell, is the same reason his rank made him so dangerous in the first place. He never needed to be in the room. He only needed to say the word, and the room did the rest. Perez was brought down by a long investigation and a 50-count indictment, the product of prosecutors deliberately digging until they had everything. Not every one of these cases works that way. Sometimes the truth only surfaces because of a mistake, a single accident that nobody intended, that flips a quiet cover-up into a federal conviction overnight. That is exactly what happened more than 700 miles away in a jail in Louisville, Kentucky, to a handcuffed teenager named Terry Whitehead. David Schwartz. David Schwartz did not simply assault a handcuffed 19-year-old. What he did afterward was arguably worse, because it was cold and deliberate rather than a loss of control in the moment. He wrote up the teenager he had just beaten and tried to have him criminally charged for it, accusing his own victim of being the aggressor. If a single accident had not intervened, it very likely would have worked, and Terry Whitehead, already sitting in custody, would have been buried under a brand new felony for a crime that existed only on a sheet of paper. Terry Whitehead was 19 years old and a pretrial detainee at Louisville Metro Corrections, which means that, Like several of the men in these cases, he had not been convicted of anything and was still legally presumed innocent. On April 15, 2018, Whitehead was handcuffed when David Schwartz punched him in the head. According to the indictment that came later, Schwartz had already hit him several times before any recording was rolling, and a supervisor had pepper sprayed him. Whitehead blacked out entirely, lost consciousness, and had to be taken to a hospital. So the sequence is worth holding on to for a second. A 19-year-old, in handcuffs, is punched repeatedly and sprayed until he passes out and needs emergency treatment. By any honest telling, he is plainly the victim of what happened in that room. And then Schwartz sat down and did the paperwork. He filed a false report, and he wrote up a citation charging Whitehead with felony third-degree assault, claiming the teenager had spat on him and attacked him. Think about what that citation was designed to accomplish. It would not just protect Schwartz. It would take a teenager who had been beaten unconscious and turn him into a convicted felon for it, stacking new prison time on top of the injuries. On paper, the handcuffed 19-year-old became the dangerous one, and the officer became the victim. Then it fell apart, and it fell apart by pure chance. Another officer, without meaning to, accidentally activated a body camera. That camera captured the punch, and it captured Schwartz slamming a metal door over and over. It caught the truth of what had happened in that room, and it existed entirely by accident, because not one person in there had intended to record any of it. When the footage surfaced, the felony charge against Whitehead was dropped, and the investigation turned around completely to face the officers who had written the lie. Schwartz was indicted in May of 2019. On October 31, 2019, he pleaded guilty to deprivation of rights under color of law and 2 counts of false reporting. On February 27, 2020, he was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release, and he was not alone in any of it. A sergeant, Donna Gentry, pleaded guilty to filing a false report and to directing another officer to copy it, and she received 8 months of home confinement. That last detail is worth sitting with. A supervisor did not just look away. She actively told another officer to reproduce the false account, which means the lie was not one man panicking, but a small chain of people agreeing to bury the same story. The officer whose camera had accidentally exposed the entire thing, Devin Edwards, also pleaded guilty, but his punishment was deliberately light. Just 12 days in custody, along with home incarceration and supervised release. That leniency was a direct acknowledgement that it was his accidental recording that had brought the truth to light in the first place. The Justice Department official who announced the case, Assistant Attorney General Eric Dreiband, said the officers had knowingly violated the constitutional rights of an inmate and then lied to cover it up, abusing the very powers that the public had entrusted to them. The jail's own assistant director, Steve Durham, was notably quick to put distance between the institution and the men, saying that the moment officials became aware of the misconduct, they had moved immediately to terminate the employees and to notify law enforcement. David Schwartz's 2-year sentence, imposed in early 2020, would have ended within a couple of years, and he has long since served it. The camera that convicted him was never supposed to be running at all. Had that officer's hand not brushed the wrong control at exactly the wrong moment, the only official record of April 15, 2018, would have been Schwartz's version, and Terry Whitehead would be the one carrying a felony conviction for it right now. That is the quiet horror sitting underneath this whole case. Not that Schwartz got caught, but how narrowly he did. Every element of the cover-up was already in place: the false report, the fabricated charge, a supervisor willing to spread the story. The only thing that failed was a piece of equipment nobody meant to switch on. In every case where that accident does not happen, there is no video, and the officer's paperwork simply becomes the truth. You might assume that a federal prosecution inside a single jail would be enough to shift the culture there, enough to make the next officer stop and think twice. It was not. Less than 3 years later, inside that very same Louisville jail system, another handcuffed man would be beaten so badly that the bones of his face gave way. And this time, there would be no camera at all. Darrell Taylor. Darrell Taylor was not set off by a weapon or an attack, or anything that could pass for a genuine threat to his safety. He was set off by an insult. A detainee said something to him that he did not like, and Taylor's response to those words was to follow the man back to his bunk and beat him until he lost consciousness. Then, with the man already limp and unconscious on the ground, Taylor lifted his body off the floor and drove it face first into the concrete. The detainee is identified in court records only by his initials, BR. He was being held at the Louisville Metro Department of Corrections, and he had reported struggling with mental health issues, which makes what happened to him all the more difficult to stomach. This was a man the jail already knew to be vulnerable. On the morning of December 15, 2020, breakfast was being served when BR said something insulting to Taylor. Insulting language from a detainee is, for a corrections officer, one of the most ordinary things that can possibly happen on a shift. It is background noise. It is the job. What it is not, under any policy anywhere, is a reason to put a man in the hospital. What followed was not a scuffle or a restraint gone wrong. Taylor followed BR back to his bunk, threw him to the ground, and punched him repeatedly until he was unconscious. And then, in the detail that separates this from a single flash of anger, he lifted the man's limp body and drove it face first into the concrete floor. The impact broke BR's jaw and his cheekbone. Taylor was not wearing a body camera, so there was no accidental footage this time. No silent recording sitting somewhere waiting to be discovered. There was only what the officers said had happened, and what Taylor himself said, and his own words turned out to be the thing that undid him. Because Taylor's story changed. In the immediate aftermath, he told another officer, plainly, that he had beaten the inmate because he was upset about the insulting language. He said nothing then about being attacked, nothing about defending himself from anyone. It was only later, once he was on trial, that a very different account appeared. One in which BR had struck him, scratched him, and spat at him. The jury was handed both versions. They had the first one, given in the moment when there was no particular reason to lie, and the second one, constructed once Taylor was facing a federal courtroom. They did not believe the second. Louisville Metro Corrections dismissed Taylor on March 17, 2021. In June of 2022, he was indicted on a single federal count of deprivation of rights under color of law, and in October of that same year, a federal jury convicted him. At sentencing, the two sides stood remarkably far apart. Prosecutors asked for at least 6 years, arguing that the sheer level of violence demanded it, that breaking a man's jaw and cheekbone after he was already unconscious was not something a courtroom could treat lightly. The defense asked for probation, for no prison time whatsoever. The gap between those two requests, 6 years on one side and nothing on the other, is its own small window into how differently people can look at the same footage. On January 25, 2023, the judge settled in the middle but closer to the floor, at 36 months, 3 years in federal prison. One of the most telling moments of the whole trial came from the jail's own director, who testified that the level of force shown on the video was inconsistent with the training that every single Louisville corrections officer receives. By the institution's own account, this was no gray area and no judgment call gone wrong. It was a straightforward violation of everything Taylor had ever been taught to do. The Justice Department's Kristen Clark, the same official who spoke in the Jenkins case down in Alabama, said Taylor had abused his authority as a law enforcement officer and betrayed the public's trust when he violently assaulted a detainee in his custody. The United States Attorney, Michael Bennett, called the assault a blatant disregard for the civil rights and the physical well-being of a man in the jail's care. And the FBI's Jody Cohen made the point that reaches past this one officer entirely, that when a single officer abuses that authority, it chips away at the trust placed in every other officer who wears the uniform honestly. Taylor's case did not land in a vacuum any more than the others did. At the time, the Louisville jail was under intense scrutiny. More than a dozen people had died in its custody since November of 2021, and a series of outside reviews of the facility soon followed. One consultant brought in to examine it described a disturbing tolerance for misconduct and dangerous uses of force that were not even being properly tracked or recorded. Read that back for a moment. Not just that officers were using excessive force, but that the institution was not even keeping count of when it happened. In an environment like that, a man breaking a detainee's face over an insult was not an aberration so much as the predictable end of a system that had stopped watching itself. Darrell Taylor's sentence of 3 years, imposed in January of 2023, would be at or very near its end by now. Every one of these men wore a uniform that was supposed to mean safety. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.